Hello and welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is grade 3 and we're on to lecture 6. Today's topic is extreme bet sizing. We're going to look at overbets, underbets, and all of the less standard things that are going to put your opponents in unfamiliar spots and also be completely theoretically sound at the same time. First off, sledgehammering. Sledgehammering is betting far more than the pot. We're not just talking about a normal overbet here, but one that's actually colossal in size, between 200 and 500% pot. This is possible when we have a region of our range which has nearly 100% equity. This means something in the vicinity of 95% plus usually, maybe a little bit less depending. We do not block large parts of villain's calling range with the hands we're going to deploy this sizing with. We're on the river, because if we're not on the river, we still have time to build the pot later. Why do we need to suddenly rush all of the way to our investment ceiling on the flop of the turn? That doesn't make sense. And when our opponent has a condensed range relative to our sledgehammer region. In other words, when we have a unique value hand that's not shared by our opponent, they don't really exist in their range. We hold the monopoly on these very powerful combos, and that allows us to go as big as we want to without incurring any downside. The initial objection to sledgehammering is, well, villain will fold all the time. Won't I just be blowing them out of the pot? How am I going to get called if I go 400% pot? That's the initial impression when you've not studied much, but when you start to look into the facets of GTO, you see that although villain does fold more, you maximize your earnings, not minimize, by going bigger, because the rate at which you earn more money than called contributes more to your EV than the frequency with which you're called. In other words, betting much larger and getting called less often usually nets a higher EV long term than betting smaller, with the caveat in place that you're not getting raised a lot. If you're getting raised a lot, then although when called you make more money by going bigger, you may be getting raised by many of the hands that are calling you should you go smaller anyway, and then that would be the higher EV sizing. The more often you're going to be raised, the more frequently you would want to go ahead and make a smaller bet with a really strong region of your range. And that's going to come down to relative polarization. So when villain's range is very condensed compared to yours and compared to your sledgehammerable value region, you're going to feel pretty confident about just going for the biggest size possible. Sledgehammering occurs in loads of spots where we reach the river with 3 or 4 times the pot still remaining, and this very lopsided range configuration where we're super polar against someone that's very condensed and capped. For example, in this 3-bet pot, blind versus blind, the small blind is going to be checking to the pre-flop 3-better all of the time on the flop. Maybe they could build a donk range on this board as it's one of the better ones for their range, but let's assume that they're not. The big blind checks behind, and then the same thing happens on the turn. When we reach the river in this way, small blind is going to be maintaining a big nut advantage. They're going to be slow playing many of their set combos, they're going to have some 2-pair, whereas big blind is going to be mostly capped at this point, the top of their range being something like ace-king, ace-queen, something that just got there on the river. This is testament to the fact that the out-of-position player can always slow play at a much higher frequency and more liberally than their in-position counterpart. On the river here for small blind, we see a very stark toolkit. We see the solver opting for 2 main bet sizes when it doesn't check. These are B33 and B450, basically all of the marbles. Why does villain get to invest all of the marbles here? Well, of course, they have a monopoly on very strong 2-pair plus hands. These hands are coming in at around 100% equity, maybe 98. Of course, big blind may have been fortunate enough here to river the top set with pocket aces, but it's going to be a rare phenomenon, and so small blind's equity is above the threshold for being able to risk 450% of the pot whenever they have a hand like a set or something of that nature, or Jack-9. That's another classic example of a hand that small blind is going to have sometimes and big blind is never going to have because the in-position player doesn't get to check back twice with a straight. Really important to ask yourself, how did we get here, and does that allow me to sledgehammer? What we see here is that this sizing paradigm can be easily explained by looking at the relative equity concentrations within ranges here. Who has a higher density of certain equities? This question is sometimes very paramount to explaining sizing choices in the solver's toolkit. As we see here, there is going to be a region of weak ace-x, 10x, things like this that are able to block bet here. And that region is only going to be able to make a small value bet because the ace-x that big blind rivers here is very much going to be a tier 2/tier 1 hand. But then sometimes, while we can't beat that ace very frequently, and while our ace-x tends to lose to the 3-better, the big blind's ace-x, we can have some rare hands at the very top here that absolutely smash that range and want to go all in. Either we've got a tier 4 kind of holding in this spot and we're not betting, and then just above that we have the B33 region here. This is the thin value region. These are the hands that are strong enough to value bet. Possibly they block bluffs because they have a kicker like a jack or something that could block potential bluffs like queen jack, king jack, and they want to go for value, understanding that of course they're getting called by more than just better aces here. Though they can't go big, partially because villain just has a better ace a lot here, and mainly just because their equity is too low. Note that if you have a really strong hand here and you go really small, you could also get raised by the ace-x region. But if you were to bet like 75% pot here or 150, you're not going to get raised by ace-x anymore, and the question is, well, why are you doing that? B33 is very dense in the small blinds range, and they're basically just going to be that plethora of weaker suited aces that's going to lose to the river very good top pair that big blind will sometimes have just picked up. Then we have the B450 region. As you can see, these hands are primarily unrivaled. There are just no corresponding dots here that are red in the in position player's range. That's because of the nature of being in position and how you just don't really get to reach this spot with Jack 9 due to the urgency of being in position and betting earlier, as I've remarked on already. In this situation, it's important for small blind to realise that if they use a very big bet here that's not B450, they're not going to be getting raised at much of a frequency at all. Therefore, it will be impossible to pick up the deficit that you're losing by not going larger. There's a mathematical proof that we looked at back in grade 2 lecture 6 when we introduced greed theorem, and we're going to look at the big cousin of greed theorem today. In greed theorem, we basically said the larger you go within reason, the more money you're going to make when called, as long as it's not a spot where your villain is quite polar and is therefore raising a lot. If you're very polar, they're very condensed. It's mathematically true that the bigger you go, the more money you make. Just to imagine a very quick thought experiment on that and to do a quick proof of that, well, if the pot's 100 and you bet something like one big blind, you're going to get called almost always, but the maximum you can win, even if you're called all of the time, is one big blind into 100 big blinds. That's terrible. If you bet 4x pot, okay, you only get called 20% of the time now, but the good news is that you're making so much money when called. So if you bet 400 chips into 100 and you're only called a fifth of the time, you're still netting 80 chips. That's 4/5 of the pot. It's really good. If you bet pot there and you're never getting raised, just again keeping this constant in place for this thought experiment, if you bet 100 into 100, you get called half the time, you only make 50 chips, not 80. So that's the proof. You can imagine that in this scale, as you go up and up and up with your sizing, you just begin to make more and more money. Again, caveat, if you're getting raised, this doesn't apply. But it depends how often. It's not either you're getting raised or you're not. It's going to happen at some frequency. River glutton theorem is the big cousin, as I say, of greed theorem that we looked at in grade 2 of the Carrot Poker School. River glutton theorem says on the river, there is no size too large when building a sizing toolkit. In fact, smaller sizes may be technical errors. This is a little bit vague, but what we're essentially saying is that you shouldn't feel bound by some kind of arbitrary social construct rules on how big you can go. The main reasons that humans don't want to follow in the footsteps of solvers and use these incredibly large sizes on the river is that they're afraid of doing something that's seemingly ridiculous or outlandish. You don't want to appear absurd as a human. You don't want to go around dressed as a clown when everyone else is in a suit. And for the same kind of fitting into the flock instinct, we also are not tempted to do things that nobody else does in poker. We don't want to go all in for 5x pot because the only people we've seen do that in our 25NL pool that we grind regularly, let's say, are weaker players who are not really thinking about a spot properly and just obviously have rivered the nuts in some case or something like that. But theoretically, if you balance this with bluffs, and you can bluff almost half the time when you go all in for 4x pot because your opponent needs almost 50% equity to call the pot, effectively is coming quite close to just being empty in relation to the bet in that case. And of course, a bet into an empty pot we know requires 50% equity to call. The upshot here is really that we need to let go of these sort of stigma that we're not allowed to empty the clip if the pot is small. This is a great example of a situation in a 3-bet pot where emptying the clip is exactly what we should do. If you're worried that you never get called here, okay, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the play. In principle, it maybe means that you need to unbalance your range to take advantage of an observed tendency. For example, if you think your opponent is one who's just never going to pay off B450 here and will just always think you have the nuts and will fold ace king 100% of the time, then you need to be only using this sizing as a bluff, but using it really frequently as a bluff. So it's never truly correct to just ditch a sizing from your toolkit for exploitative reasons. It's usually the case that you have to actually just modify your range such that you're using an unbalanced strategy now as opposed to a theoretical one. The following hands lose EV by using B75 instead of jamming. Jack 9, clearly going to be an EV loss because, as I say, with B75 you just don't get raised anywhere near as often as you would if you were deploying the smaller B33. When we look at the EVs here, we see that B33 doesn't lose as much EV compared to the jam as one of these more mediocre sizes. B75 loses the most EV in percent pot, losing 7% pot compared with jam, whereas B33 only loses about 2% pot compared with jam and GTO. The reason for this is, of course, that the bigger you go, the less you incentivize your opponent to raise. There's essentially a sweet spot where you can bet smaller and get raised a lot, and that's okay, or you can bet really big and never get raised, and that's okay as well. But what you can't do with a hand like this, when you have this bigger polarization advantage, when there's such an asymmetry in ranges, is go mediocrely big, like just go kind of big but not really. In those cases, you're decimating villain's raise frequency without earning enough when called in the process. We've seen that mathematical proof, we know how that works. Pocket 4 is another hand that we're going to do this with. Obviously this time it's a bluff, it's close to break even, you get 3.27% pot here by going all in with this hand. It's the highest EV play based on the blockers that you have here, and this is the way you should be playing very frequently. It does take a little bit of an iron stomach, shall we say, to go ahead and pull the trigger in a spot such as this, but when you think about it, your fold equity is through the roof. You're going to jam here and you should be getting 80-85% fold equity, so that's going to feel pretty good to just win the pot almost always by jamming here. Sometimes you get called, and the mindset trick of the trade at this point in the hand is to not feel bad when you get called as much as possible. Not to feel silly. I mean, you can feel bad, you can feel as though, oh, I wish that had gotten through, that's a shame that didn't get through, let me analyze that later. These are all fine thoughts to have, but I thought like, oh my god, what an idiot, I'll never do that again. I've been caught with my hand well and truly in the cookie jar. This isn't a good reaction to getting called when you make an outlandishly big bluff. It's not actually a bad thing to do. It looks crazy, it's fine. Ace-10 of hearts, this is another hand that is strong enough here, and obviously the Ace-10 of hearts has the powerful bonus of blocking pocket aces while also beating Ace-King, Ace-Queen. So it does block Ace-King, Ace-Queen, but it also blocks pocket aces, and that makes its equity higher than you would think here, and you can see that the EV of Ace-10 here is not actually too far away from the EV of the immortal nuts, that's to say, of the Jack-9 of spades. There are EV losses here, and I want to put them into context for you guys a little bit. In big blinds then, we're actually losing 1.36 big blinds in the first case by not jamming. By using B75 instead of jam, we're losing 0.61 big blinds in the next case and 2.31 in the case of Ace-10 of hearts by picking the wrong sizing. What does this mean? Well, to put it into perspective for you, if you're playing a game like 500 Zoom or 2.5 Live, you're basically throwing away $11.55 when you pick the wrong sizing in theory with Ace-10 of hearts. Obviously, we need to be careful that we don't adopt theoretical EV as a benchmark for our real EV, and that we understand intelligently that real life factors can interfere with what this EV is supposed to be. It would be insane to think that our EV is exactly that depicted by the solver, because that would mean that every condition was in place. In other words, the chances of that happening are a bit like my garden and yours containing exactly the same number of flowers or blades of grass or something like that. It's just too ridiculous to expect those things to line up. But the thing is that when you don't have an exploitative adjustment to hand and you're not sure which way the exploitative factors are pointing and by what margin, you're better off adopting the theoretically correct play, because on average that's going to make you more money than some random deviation that doesn't have any logic behind it. There's a fine line between copying solvers like a mindless zombie and just full-blown exploiting for no reason. There's a balance there, and you need to find it. You need to walk the tightrope to some extent in this regard. Reacting to a sledgehammer, what do we do if our opponent's sledgehammer against us? Well, the bigger the sizing we face, the more counterintuitive the response strategy is likely to become. This is because blockers are going to begin to play a larger and larger role as more money is shoveled into the pot. As ranges become more succinct and snug, blockers can definitely incorporate and remove a larger chunk of your opponent's range than normal, and this gives a bigger EV or equity swing to holding that combo as opposed to not. How different do you think the following two hands are to defend in this spot, and which is going to be better? Remembering that we are the big blind player here facing this gargantuan shove, we do have some pretty bizarre hands in our range in this case, and in the 3-bet pot we've 3-bet things like Jack 8 off, sometimes 10-5 suited pre, because we're playing a very polarized strategy in position blind versus blind, the mediocre region of our range just becoming so good to flat here. Which one would you rather call with and why? Have a think about this. Okay, let's explore the EV. So this is the overall defense strategy we're meant to make. You can see that we're actually always supposed to fold most of our range here, and there are some combos that begin to mix call, like ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack at a low frequency. We're meant to do some strange bluff catching here. You can see the jack 8 there is actually going to be a call a lot of the time, and it's going to be very close to break even, just coming in at basically 0 EV loss. Obviously the solver can't solve this to exact accuracy because it's a large pot and the solver is accurate only to a certain percentage of the pot. As the pot gets bigger, you'll see a bigger swing in big blinds between actions that are both being chosen. That's not because the solver's an idiot and it's saying, oh, one is better than the other, but let's just take the one that's worse. Sometimes it isn't sure yet. It doesn't have enough accuracy to say with certainty what the EV of this is, but basically it's going to end up being close enough to 0 that it doesn't matter in such a big pot. These situations come along very rarely, so the solver is basically saying this doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things because this spot will come up a lot, it'll come up infinite times, and this will be a tiny swing, whereas if you're in a smaller pot, it's going to be a much bigger swing in percentage pot. Back to the main idea of the story here, which is that Jack 8 has very good blockers, but as we've seen in really unfavourable worlds when we face these gigantic bets, even the hands that have fairly good blockers are going to end up just being mixes. When you're facing such a big bet, you need to fold almost everything in order for your opponent to be indifferent with bluffing, because your opponent requires so much fold equity in the first place in order to bluff. The Jack 8, why is it good? In the first place, it has a Jack, which is a blocker to Jack 9, which is really nice. I also think the small blind player will lead a lot of Jack X bluffs on the turn immediately, because they are frail hands with a bit of extra stuff going on, and they're not very tempting hands to check. So I don't think we have too much of a negative Y factor here, but we definitely have a lot of X factor going on. Secondly, hands like pocket 8s are also going to formulate a lot of the small blinds jamming range, and so blocking them becomes really important. One thing I'd like to add about facing sledgehammers and large sizes in general is that it does become a bit more important to have strong X factor in the terminology of Lecture 4. That meant blocking your opponent's positive value combos, because they tend to share a lot more in common now. Because when you go B450, there only are a few combos that actually qualify in this 95 to 100% equity band. Therefore, you can actually interfere with them very heavily by having certain cards. When you don't have those cards because you have a random hand like 10-5, which doesn't have those positive blockers, the call is actually highly losing in such a bad world for your range. When you face this, you basically are in a situation where almost every hand in your range is a bluff catcher, and you can only call the ones with very positive blockers. 10-5 has absolutely nothing positive going on. The 5 may even block some combos of bluffs. We saw pocket 4s bluffing earlier. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to infer that pocket 5s can also bluff maybe therefore, and because of this we want to be pretty careful that we don't just go randomly calling combos here without having very positive blockers. Essentially, you should seek incredibly positive looking blockers to even mix call in a situation like this. We move on now to the antithesis of the sledgehammer, which is feathering. Feathering is the opposite of sledgehammering. It means betting between 10 and 20% of the pot. This is another thing that GTO will do from time to time, and it's another thing which you may feel faintly absurd for doing in your games before you've actually come to terms, not just logically speaking, but also emotionally speaking, that this is an okay thing to do. Whenever I'm streaming, and I stream a lot these days, I tend to get feedback from people who maybe haven't studied a lot of GTO, they haven't done a course like the Carrot Poker School, and they're more going by the common hearsay of what people are doing, saying, what their buddies are saying, what their Discord group is discussing, what people say down at the local card room, and betting 10% pot is just something that doesn't really happen very much. The only people who do this are the absolutely obvious recreational players. So there's a bit of a curve here where very bad players will sledgehammer off feather, average players won't, and then very good players will again start sledgehammering and feathering, because these things are actually good. It's just that the recreational players are doing it for the wrong reason, and the average regs aren't doing it because they've convinced themselves that it's bad. They're not that confident. They're very prone to just following the herd and trying to blend in and not do anything too embarrassing or whatever. They're just trying to survive, basically, right? When you're a mediocre reg, just learning your trade. But when you become a good reg, when you start actually understanding how the game works, you realize that in No Limit Hold'em, you have this beautiful freedom to express your poker self in all of these different ways and use these sizes if you do it in the right way, not actually committing any kind of affront or offense of logic. The philosophy of poker aside, this sizing is more common than you would think in GTO outputs if you provide the input. A lot of people also don't use this play because they don't give the solver the input to do this. Then one day they suddenly say, I wonder what happens if I allow my solver to just use this bizarre sizing, and then lo and behold, the solver does it all the time and they're like, wow, I didn't know this was a thing, but this is the thing. So it's kind of crazy. We have a graph here that's going to basically portray the finishing equity for two different sizes across some different situations and types of hands that we could be holding in this spot. With Jack 10, Ace 3 suited and Ace 9, these are examples of hands that are doing different things. With Jack 10, we have a hand that's actually fairly low down. It's coming in at not very much equity at all. The landing equity is just above 50%. Then there's a B20 finishing equity and a B33 finishing equity, meaning that when we use these sizes respectively, we have a certain amount of equity when our opponent calls us, not raises us. We're not looking at this branch for now. We're just leaving that aside, but that will be relevant and we'll touch on that in a minute. Interestingly, the B20 finishing equity is above the landing equity. This looks really bizarre. Like, what on earth is going on? Surely I cause a filtering effect in my opponent's range when I use this sizing. How on earth can my equity go up? The reason it goes up is that you actually get raised a lot of the time that you're losing here. When you B20, it's a bit like checking, and villain is incentivized to bet most of the hands, i.e. raise most of the hands here against your feather that are beating Jack 10. This illustrates why this line is okay. When called, you actually have a ton of equity. You don't get raised often enough here for this to be a terrible thing, although it's obviously bad when you get raised. I mean, you can call, you can fold, your EV is just going to get reduced to pretty much near zero. But the really interesting thing to take from this is that when we're out of position, checking is not really the holy grail. It's not such a great line. And the reason for that is that we're going to face bets. We're going to not be able to keep much of our EV whenever we face a bet. We're going to be reduced to having something like 0 EV, just as when we get raised here, we have something like 0 EV. If upon checking, our EV is frequently going to be reduced to 0, betting with 50% equity and surviving kind of when called can't be too bad of a thing. It's not actually true. When we get to this level of the Carrot Poker skill, we need to admit this. It's not actually true that we need to have plus 50% finishing equity to make a bet out of position that's primarily for value. The reason for that is you're not comparing the line with just getting to showdown and checking down. If you were, it would be absurd to make a bet where you were a dog when called. But because you sometimes just have to call off extra money anyway, as an underdog against the range that's betting against you, say villain bets 75% pot, you need 30% equity to call that bet, but you have maybe 40%, so you have to call, but you're still taking the worst of it in a bigger pot when you check and call. Because disadvantageous branches from the point of decision here are happening, we are able to bet hands that aren't pure value bets. They're just kind of surviving, they're doing okay. Maybe they're even a slight dog when called, and the feather is a good way to do that. Out of position, the feather makes a lot of sense. In position, the feather would be a really absurd idea. It would just simply be a vessel to reopening the action without really getting much EV or much gain. Feathers are things we use out of position, unless exploitatively, so I wouldn't recommend using a feather in position on the river. Let's move on to Ace 3. This is another hand that can feather. It's actually a stronger hand than Jack 10, but it has more of a preference for feathering than the Jack 10 did. This is a strange phenomenon. I can't really explain why this hand is not B33ing, and I don't really want to because the EVs just run so close together. I think I'd be kind of grasping at straws here. I don't think it really makes sense to try to solve such a close phenomenon, but basically with a hand like Ace 3, we can definitely assert that either the feather or the small bet is good. Maybe we could say something like we unblock more bluffs with Ace 3 than we do with Jack 10, so when we feather and get raised, we actually call this hand and it makes a bit of money, so something like that, but I think it's fairly meaningless and close. There's a lot of equity this time when we feather and get called. That's because obviously we'd get raised by most of the hands that would beat us here. Just a few of them that are calling here are above 75% when our feather gets called. When we're using the smaller bet size here, we also just expect to get called wider and get called by more weak hands. When we B33, that's also just going to be okay in this spot. Nothing wrong with it at all, and we can certainly do that. And then finally, when we have the A6 of hearts, it's the same kind of story. We can just go ahead and make these small bets. This time our equity is nearly 100% when called because practically every better hand in A6 is going to raise us here. There's nothing else to really say here. It's just that when you land in situations where your range is commonly block betting, B33ing in GTO, if you were to add a smaller sizing to your toolkit, the solver would use that as well. One really interesting thing is that the smaller you go, the more people fail to realize that they should be raising against that sizing for value. You will get opponents, because they're humans and their brain just sort of scans the bet size vaguely without thinking in too much detail about exactly how big it is. You'll find that many humans don't react at all, or react very minimally and inelastically to the difference between B20 and B33. When you start B10ing, B5ing, stuff like this, it gets a little bit more likely that you get raised a ton, and that can suddenly trigger quite a lot of raising within the minds of certain opponents. But for the most part, when you're B33ing or B25ing or B20ing, it often doesn't make much difference. What this can mean is that the feather is a very useful tool to wield more exploitatively. For example, if you think your opponent is going to fail to adapt to the difference between B33 and B20, then you could do something like B33ing your value hands and B20ing your bluffs, giving yourself a better price for bluffing and earning more when you're value betting without incurring enough of a change in fold equity when betting to really feel any downside to that. If you are bluffing, you also don't want to get rebluffed raised, because you're going to have to fold, and if your opponent isn't realizing that against B20 they need more raises and therefore more bluff raises, then again you get away with one when you adopt that sizing. This is food for thought. What this comes down to is the idea that the less familiar your opponent is going to be with a certain spot, the more likely they are to misplay. Feathering with the condensed range. Here we have a check call situation, big blind versus button on Jack 9-7. We then check the turn and button checks back, and we have this classic river probe situation. Our range is condensed, it's merged, we don't have a lot of straights here because we would raise flop with them. Same goes with 2-pair and sets, that we have a few hands we've just turned, like Jack 6 suited, 7-6 suited, 9-6 suited, but overall we don't have a lot of very strong hands here. So there'll be a very large vicinity of our range that wants to value bet, and the smaller we go, the more of that we can value bet. So if villain is really used to facing a check on the river here and has some idea what they're doing in a bet check bet node, but they haven't faced B20, B10 or B15 very often, then we can start to feather here with a wider range than that with which we could B33. We can even replace our B33 with a B20 and just put villain into this gross spot way more often. It's not gross to a solver, or objectively speaking, it is gross if you've hardly ever faced it. The theoretical gain of feathering is relatively small here. A B20 hand could almost always choose either B33 or check without an EV loss, so the really strong B20 hands can just B33 and the really weak ones can just check. It's not a big deal. The average ones will be probably quite indifferent between those two options. Pocket 8s, for example, it can be 33, there's no issue with this at all, but it can also be 20. You can see that the EV difference is like so microscopic between those sizes that theoretically speaking, this sort of thing just doesn't matter. A7 can check. It's meant to be a small mistake to B33 this hand, it's slightly too weak, but you can also B20 it. But again, if you did B33 this hand, it's so close to the threshold that you're barely losing any EV whatsoever. When we look at the overall strategy here with 5 sizes, this now looks like the dreaded myriad of different things that we'd like to avoid. Looking at this at face value looks quite intimidating, but later today we're going to learn how to actually balance the bluffs in this toolkit between all of these sizes. We will want to cut out some of these sizes, I'm just showing you this for demonstrative purposes, but basically with the value combos it's quite easy and quite simple to follow this strategy. You're just going to be betting bigger as your equity gets bigger, blocker anomalies aside. So if you aren't blocking the calling range for a certain sizing, it's correct to just use that with your big hands. For example, you can see here that King Jack suited is going for a really big bet, going for the B150. You can see that something like Jack 9, which is 2-pair or pocket 7s, is going for the overbet on this spot. And you can see that hands like pocket 8s are feathering or B33ing. Meanwhile, you'll have like a mediocre Jack or a good 9 or something that's able to B75. The value hands play themselves. You don't have to think too hard. When you have a fairly merged range against a very condensed range, you just want to put in the maximum. Mostly for each of your value hands. You do lose EV here by going too small with King Jack. Of course, you also lose EV by going too big with a hand like pocket 8s. It's trickier when it comes to your bluffs, but the trick is just to think about the sizes that would be in your toolkit for value. And as we saw earlier on in the Carrot Poker School Grade 3, try to mix them in based on both their pot odds prevalence, meaning if you go really small, you can't have very many bluffs in that size, as bluffs have to be quite rare. If you go bigger, you can have more bluffs, but it's also going to matter how often these hands are in your toolkit for value, and therefore you want to construct using how common the hands are in your value range, and therefore how often that bet size will be deployed overall, but also being conscious of the bluff to value ratio that bet size requires from you. The smaller you go, the less often you can be bluffing because the better pot odds you're offering your opponent. We'll see this in detail in a minute, but first off, some exploitative arguments for feathering. You might be thinking, well, Pete, if these things don't add much EV, why would I want to complicate my strategy by throwing them into the mix? I've got enough to think about. I've already got 26 lectures of the Carrot Poker School to revise, and I don't know what I'm doing. Why would I adopt this? Don't adopt this if it would overly complicate your game and you have too much else to work on. But if you're at grade 3 level and you're finding that you're having an okay time assimilating the concepts from the school, it might be time to start making life more difficult for your opponents. Poker is not just a quest to get perfect theoretical play down to a T and just play like the solver and copy it in every node. That doesn't actually maximize your EV. While it does keep you watertight and solid, it's not a way of increasing your EV to the highest potential. So then, why incorporate B20 at all? It comes down to exploitative reasons and mainly familiarity theorem. Familiarity theorem is the idea that regs will misplay far more often versus sizes they have scarcely encountered compared with those with which they are more acquainted. Weaker players will also misplay more against sizes they've not seen, but because weaker players tend to misplay everywhere all the time and to a large extent, it won't be played as badly compared to the sizes they've seen as it would be with the regs. The regs tend to have the more common sizes down a lot more, although they still make mistakes, they're more solid. The difference between facing a familiar size and an unfamiliar size is less stark when it comes to the weaker player population because they misplay so much against everything. One of my favourite quotes in the world of all time in history comes from the very tactically minded and imaginative Mikhail Tal, a chess player who was very, very big around the sort of 50s, 60s, that sort of thing, and was world champion at one point. He played a very sacrificial, aggressive game where he liked to give away all of his pieces and throw the kitchen sink as opponents, so to speak. And Mikhail Tal once basically quantified his approach to the game in the following sentence. He kind of admitted that what he was doing wasn't necessarily the most sound or logical thing, and he wasn't maybe playing objectively the best moves. In chess, there are these things called chess engines that solve a position and tell you exactly what you should play, but those aren't always the most effective moves against humans. So Tal said you must take your opponent into a deep dark forest where 2 + 2 = 5, and the path leading out is only wide enough for one. This is an extremely famous quote within the chess community. Many chess content creators use this quote left, right, and center, and for good reason. It can also be applied in poker. The idea here is in poker, if you have two lines that are basically the same EV theoretically, it doesn't make sense to choose one over the other due to solely objective factors. And so we might want to think subjectively about what our opponent is most likely to lose EV against, because poker is a zero-sum game. So when your opponent loses EV, it goes straight into your pocket, assuming you're in a heads-up pot. Because of this, your opponent's losses are your wins. So if we can lure a villain into this world where he's more likely to screw up, our EV goes up majorly. Therefore, eventually, and when we're comfortable and when we don't feel like we'd be completely overloading ourselves to our own detriment, we should consider building our toolkit around the sizes people have little to no practice dealing with, such as B450 and B20. That's right, if you're playing a studied opponent, it's way more likely they'll mess up against B20 rather than B33. Maybe they'll miss raises they need to be making for value, maybe they won't bluff raise enough, making the EV of your bets just higher in general whenever you don't have a great hand. And maybe they'll just do things wrong, they'll just have the wrong hand selection for different purposes. When this happens, like I say, in a zero-sum game, it's us that gain from villains' missteps. Have fun with this, introduce it carefully. Why not go away with your solver today and just get these creative juices flowing, get that spark reignited in your poker game and say, do you know what, I'm going to plug in like 10% pot in the river, I'm going to see how the solver uses it, and then I'm going to try it out in game and see how people react. You can have a lot of fun with this as long as you know that what you're doing isn't theoretically terrible, and usually it won't be. If you understand enough GTO to know something like, okay, my range is quite condensed here, I have a lot of really weak but plausibly value bettable hands, I'm going to adopt B20 or B15, whatever you want, you don't have to copy my exact sizing template, then you can't really go wrong as long as you bluff scarcely. We'll look at doing that in a second. You don't want to end up over bluffing here by just going for a bluff every time with this small size. That's going to be absurd because your opponent can call so easily. But yeah, you can have a lot of fun, and it's definitely a way of making the game a bit more fresh and energizing yourself again in poker to play around with these sizes. In my exploitative course, I actually talk a lot about what we call sidelines, which are non-standard actions, maybe donk bets in certain spots, small raises in certain spots, tiny sizes, huge sizes, that sort of thing. And sidelines are great because they may not cost any EV in practice or even in theory, but they can earn you a lot of money in practice by getting villain out of their comfort zone. One of my favorite topics. I could go on and on here, but let's move on. Let's get back to the point of today's class. Simplifying to only feather blocks, let's say that we've decided that in order to lure a villain into the deep dark forest more effectively, it behooves us to use the smaller of the 2 block sizes, and we want to actually get rid of the B33, the more standard bet, from our range in this condensed spot where both players have a merged range and will be using small sizes. This strategy replaces the B33 with the B20. The color coding gets more and more yellow here as we go smaller, more and more purple as we go big. That's the color coding scheme in the school. Now villain will be facing these feather bets, these B20s, at a much higher frequency, thus increasing his scope for making errors, so we hope. Meanwhile, our strategy is very intuitive. More on how to build this shortly with our bluffs. First off, why might villains make more mistakes versus feathering? We're arguing that this deep dark forest is going to be beneficial for us to lure our opponent into. We're arguing that in general our foe is going to commit more mistakes against this sizing, but why and what will these mistakes be? Here is a reaction for villain in the aforementioned spot. To remind you of the action sequence here, we are looking at Jack 9, 7, 6 deuce. We're looking at a spot where we have gone ahead and called the flop as big blind, checked the turn, and then we have the chance to probe the river after our in position opponent checks back. By examining the solver's response, this is the way the in position player handles B20 here, we can predict 3 categories in my opinion of likely human errors. Firstly, undervalue raising. Look at this. Jack 5 is a huge blunder to not value raise, coming in at 6% of the pot deficit in EV. Why is this? When you think about the construction of our own feather range, our B20 range, it's supposed to be quite weak for value and then a few bluffs smattered in there. So Jack 5 is going to just start with like 87% equity or something, and it's going to have to raise with that much. While there are certain blocker properties and hands that we can slow play for B20 instead of a bigger bet, by and large, our range will be underprotected. That's okay, that's not an imbalanced thing. That's just the way GTO is meant to go. Use a bigger sizing with your bigger hands, that's fine. It's not imbalanced because you're bluffing sometimes with each size, but it does mean the villain gets to have a fairly low down value threshold when raising these bets. So Jack 5 of diamonds, it's one you could miss. You could face the B20 and say, oh, I call, but you've got to raise this hand. It's super important. And if you're playing against someone that's too placid, that doesn't understand how to play against very small bets, they'll make a mistake. They'll make a mistake as well against B33, but they'll make a bigger one against B20. Underbluff raising is another absolutely rampant leak in this spot. When you get here with a hand like 5-4, it's incredibly unnatural to want to raise. You've got here with nothing, you're giving up, you can't see how this hand obviously has positive blockers for raising, but a hand like this is innocuous and it tends to unblock your opponent's bluffs and weak value bets. It tends to just be a hand that doesn't interfere with what your opponent's folding here after they feather. The in-position player is definitely incentivized to bluff raise combos like this, and we can see that they even lose 1 or 2% pot by not doing so when the blockers are this favorable by having such a good Y factor. If Y factor confuses you, go back a couple of classes and remind yourself of what that means. It's all about unblocking your opponent's weak hands. So if they have to raise a hand like 5-4 all the time and have to raise a hand like Jack 5 all the time, we can see how we just don't face enough raises on this node against humans. Thirdly, overfolding could also happen here with a hand like Ace Queen offsuit, which looks really terrible. It just looks like air. This board is connected. It's got 4 mediocre danger level cards. 6, 7, 9 and Jack are all cards that are just in big blind's range really frequently. This is quite hard to miss. It's not a tempting texture to call down Ace Queen on, even to a tiny bet. And then there's also the compulsion, the idea, the fear that you may just be getting milked with a small bet. A lot of regs say things to me in coaching like, I just don't think villain's ever bluffing for this sizing, and that can be a dangerous thought process because while many opponents aren't bluffing when they feather at all, the ones who are overdoing it because you're meant to only have about 4 value bets to every 1 bluff, or even more than that, like 4.5 value bets to every 1 bluff. When you get down to like 20-15%, it becomes insane how infrequently you need to be bluffing. So even though there are a lot of opponents that don't bluff at all when they feather, the people who do bluff overbluff dramatically, and therefore Ace Queen is not such a clever fold against pool. Overfolding is also going to happen here. We're just going to see people misappropriate how often they have to call these average bluff catchers, and this is maybe a grade C bluff catcher, but as we saw last time in lecture 5 of grade 3, we need to be calling average bluff catchers against small bets, and we need to even be calling bad ones at some frequency. Very easy for villain to misstep here. Do consider adding feathers to your strategy. Let's talk about splitting up value hands. This is the easier part of range construction on the river. When we're building these river probe strategies, and we will get into these spots super frequently, which is why we spend so much time talking about things like river probe, they're incredibly important to your win rate due to the frequency with which they come up. In these spots, we need to develop the rough skill of placing a hand in a landing equity bucket or tier, the hand's equity before our river action. When we land here with a bluffing tier, that's something with 0 to 23% landing equity in this spot. You might think that's ridiculous, why would I bluff with 23% landing equity? Because the world is insanely favourable for your range. Bluffing isn't just about showdown value, as we know, it's all about comparing the EV of bluffing to the EV of checking. In other words, hands that have a little bit of showdown value here have positive bluffing EV because bluffing is so great when fold equity was so far above the pot odds norm. Tier 4 hands come in at around 24 to 57%. These hands don't have enough going on to bet for value, nor would they have little enough equity to bluff. They have negative bluffing EV, not because bluffing is terrible, bluffing is highly profitable, but checking is too good now. Tier 3 hands, these are the ones we're going to consider feathering instead of B33ing, or just go back to B33ing if we want to leave that off the table for now. These come in at around 58 to 74% equity, and while they are doing really well pre-filtering, post-filtering, they'll struggle a bit more if they bet too big. Tier 2 hands around 75 to 90% landing equity. These ones will not want to go massive, but they can make a big bet. Tier 1, 91 to 96%, this is your B150 region, your classic overbet, and when we get up to Tier 0, at 97 to 100% equity, this is where the sledgehammers come into the fray. Here are some examples when we have a bluffing tier hand. For example, King Queen, a hand that would be entitled maybe to a little bit of the pot by checking, but hardly any. I can see villain checking back some King Queen, King 10 here, not being in a great world and needing to control their own bluff frequency. That doesn't mean though that we should check, because fold equity is just too high here, it's at a premium, so we want to capitalize on that and bet, even if this hand has 11% equity or something of that nature. Pocket 3s has too much equity, it's within the band of 24 to 57%, I think it's probably around 30-35% equity, something like that. That's way too much to squander by bluffing, we're going to be checking this one. Building your value region is extremely easy. When you have a hand like 9-8, you're going to feather if you're using feather, or you're going to use B33 if not. I would not recommend having both the standard block bet, the B33, and the feather in your strategy. It doesn't really make sense, it's overly complex, and it doesn't actually add any EV to your game. If your rationale for feathering, moreover, is to make your opponent uncomfortable and cause mistakes that way, then why would you want to dilute those lovely feather bets with some standard B33s at the expense of the simplicity of your strategy? Tier 2 hands like Jack 10 of hearts are going to be the classic B75s in this case. It's a good rule of thumb that if the board is not super wet and you're in a late position battle and you've called a small flop bet and landed on the river, that decent top pair will just be a B75 all the time. Tier 1 hand like King Jack, beating almost all of villain's range now because of course the in position player just has this really simple urgency to go ahead and blast turn with their good hands. This allows us to get quite confident here when we're holding good pair top kicker and go for this sort of overbet. Ace Jack is going to bet turn a lot, 2 pair sets are going to bet turn almost always. Villain is not slow playing, 10-8 on this node. And then tier 0, when you have 2 pair, why not go for it? You're unblocking overpairs. These are calling you sometimes. The bigger you go, the more money you make. This is a spot where you get raised sometimes by going smaller, but not a lot because villain is more capped than you are. It's incredibly simple that when you have a value hand, you just ask which tier it is, what's its landing equity, and you just pick the sizing that correlates to that. This is not unbalanced. You don't have to fear being exploited. It's okay that villain knows that you don't have a straight when you B75. It's okay that villain knows that King Jack B150s, but 9-8 B20s. That's not unbalanced, because your job is not to balance value hands with other value hands, rather, your job is to balance value hands with bluffs. That's what makes your opponent indifferent, so don't make arbitrarily weird balancing acts like throwing Jack 10 into an overbet sometimes. That's crazy, and it's putting disguise before EV. Poker is a game of EV, that's what solvers use to determine what you should do, and that should be your metric as well. Note the threshold between bluff and check will shift based on world favorability. The point at which you want to start bluffing is very much a function of base fold equity compared to pot odds norm fold equity. We've seen this all the way throughout the Carrot Poker School. The hardest and final part of this lecture, and the hardest part for sure, is how to split your bluffs up. Warning: if you're feeling a bit tired, take a break at this point. The next couple of slides are quite complicated, and I don't want you to feel like you need to apply them at face value. I'm going to go into unnecessarily finely grained detail to show you how a formula for picking bluffs would work. I do not expect you to use this formulaically or mathematically in game. I just want to show you the nuts and bolts, as this is a very theoretical part of the course. Splitting our bluffs up requires a more sophisticated approach. We can't just say, this hand has X equity, we bet this size, because no bluffs really have any equity. They're not betting for equity, but rather fold equity, and there aren't big differences in our fold equity between our bluffs, only small ones based on blockers. There are two relevant factors to decide a bluff ratio for a given bet size. In other words, to decide how often you're going to choose a certain size for your bluffs. In less favourable worlds, we will also sometimes have to check our air hands because we're just not going to generate enough fold equity to allow us to bluff with everything. The two factors I want you to look at are the size abundance in our toolkit, in other words, how many value hands are picking a sizing in the first place, and secondly, the pot odds modifier. What sort of value to bluff ratio does the sizing require me to wield based on the pot odds it offers to my opponent? The abundance of a bet size in our strategy will set a baseline for how often it's used as a bluff, and because our value hands drive the bus and our bluffs are the passengers of said vehicle, the value hands and their prevalence in our range are going to dictate first and foremost how often we use a certain sizing when bluffing. In other words, if we have a ton of B150s in a very uncapped range against a capped one, we're going to use B150 a lot as a bluff. Not just because it's abundant for value, but because B150 affords us a high bluff to value ratio, mathematically speaking. We then add the pot odds modifier to reflect the rough bluff to value ratio the sizing should generally deploy. What this means is that bigger bet sizes will have a higher and larger bluff to value ratio, so we can multiply the size abundance as dictated by the value range in our strategy by the pot odds modifier to figure out roughly how often to use each sizing as a bluff. And we do have to do this roughly. We're not computers, we don't have perfect information, and we can't compute complex equations in 5 seconds even if we did. I speak for myself here, maybe some of you can. Billen's break-even equity against each of these sizes goes as follows. Against a B400, they're going to need 45% to call because this is almost like betting something big into an empty pot. The pot size is dwarfed by the bet size. B150 comes in at 37.5%, 30% for B785, and a lowly 14% for the feather bet. That's why it's so tricky to defend against. The pot odds modifier then is going to go as follows. These are ratios based on how high the percentages are compared to each other. In other words, we're saying that the ratio of 14% to 45% is like 0.5 to 1.5. The ratio of 30% to 45% is 0.9 to 1.5. Essentially, we're just comparing the bluff to value ratio of these bet sizes to one another. The higher the tolerance for bluffs within a bet size, the larger the number dictated by the pot odds modifier, the more abundant a bet size choice will become in our strategy because we'll be taking its rough abundance, which is dictated by how many value combos use that size, and multiplying that number by a larger modifier. This is all based on pot odds and again, how much equity villain would need to call us. We're trying to stay balanced with respect to our bluffs, to our value hands, though we're not balancing value hands with other value hands, like I said. Let's do this. Let's show you how to do this in action. This isn't easy, but we're going to take it one step at a time, and you're not going to do this in game. I just want you to see how the theory works in this respect and how solvers pick their bluff to value ratios. Solvers actually do it much more complexly than humans do because they factor in like really meaningless things like tiny blocker shifts in equity and fold equity and stuff like that between combos. We're not going to do that today. We're just going to look at crafting an overall sensible strategy. We have the amount of the time that we're actually using these bets, we have the size abundance, the pot odds modifier, and then finally the splitting up of our bluffs. The size abundance in our strategy, this refers to how often the sizing is used for value. This is what drives the bus, the bluffs are the passengers, this is the first port of call. With B450, the all-in sizing here, I wrote B400, actually the solver simplified that to all-in. Take that with a pinch of salt, it's fine. not a big difference. That's being used 8% of the time. We'll just pretend it's B400 for our purposes. The B150 is being used 22% of the time because there are way more value hands that qualify for that sizing because it's a lower equity band in which the hands are more abundant. The B75 is being used 33% of the time. It's a very common sizing in our strategy, and the feather is being used a whopping 37% of the time, being the most common choice from the point of view of how many value hands can use that sizing. But that's not the end of the story. What happens next is we need to multiply the pot odds modifier, which is essentially the bluff to value ratio of one bet size compared to another, by the size abundance in order to get the true frequency that we should be selecting a certain sizing with our bluffs. What this means is that when we multiply 8% by 1.5, we get 12%, while the value region of our range is only 8% of it. So while only 8% of our value bets are choosing the largest sizing possible here, because that sizing has such a big pot odds modifier relative to the other sizes, we're going to go ahead and increase the amount of the time we use bluffs in this sizing up to 12%. We're multiplying 8 by 1.5. We're not doing this in game. Don't worry, this is just the mechanics of the spot. The B150 is being used 22% of the time for value. We get a little bit of a boost to that because we're allowed quite a lot of bluffs to value, though nowhere near as many as we're allowed with the B400, so this creeps up to 24% of our bluffs now using this sizing. 30% of our bluffs will use B75. This is the most commonly bluffed sizing. The reason for that is that it's by far one of the more commonly chosen sizes for value. There's quite a lot of value hands in this belt of equity. 33% of them. Then we have to reduce that slightly when we're bluffing because this size affords us a few less bluffs to value as a ratio. So the pot odds modifier here is 0.9 and that gives us our 30% bluff frequency. The block bet is used all the time, but it has an incredibly low bluff to value ratio. When you're feathering, you can bluff hardly ever. You need to be mostly value heavy, otherwise your opponent can just click call until their heart's content and exploit you. Therefore, we wind up with just 19% of our range choosing this sizing. That's still quite a lot because it's such a common size in our strategy for value. Overall, the only part you need to be aware of is the bottom part, and you want to just roughly estimate that in game based on the above two factors. So instead of doing this fiendish calculation, it would be much better just to say, okay, I have a few B400s here, they're not a lot in my strategy, but because I'm allowed to bluff quite frequently, I'll just increase the amount of the time I'm bluffing with that sizing compared with how abundant the size was for value. Bluff to value ratio is large with a really large bet. That's how we're going to do it. And similarly, when it comes to the feather bet, we're going to say this is a super abundant size. I use it all the time for value because I just have so many of these mediocre equity hands. However, I'm aware that I can't bluff a lot with that sizing, so I'm going to sort of half the amount of the time I'm able to actually select this size with a bluff compared with the abundance of this sizing in my value range. Practical take is much easier, thankfully, and unlike the solver, we should not try to choose really precise bluffing frequencies combo by combo for two very good reasons. Firstly, it's impossible. You just can't do this. You don't have the mental bandwidth. And secondly, it adds almost no EV at equilibrium even if we could do it. What you'll see solvers do is mixing in different bluff sizes with different combos at kind of bizarre frequencies based on microscopic blocker fluctuations between combinations. We don't want to do that. It doesn't add any EV in the real world, and it's stupidly complex and impossible to understand. Here we have Jack 9-7 Rainbow. We have the same situation, the check on the turn after the B33 is called on the flop, the probe opportunity for big blind. The solver says, with King 10, mostly B75, that wasn't the rough allocation. If we go back to the previous slide, we know that the average bluff is using way less B75 than that and way more feather than that. If we look at the horizontal split there in the hand, it would also have more B150 and maybe slightly more B400 as well. So that King 10 is grossly overpopulated with B75 in the solver's mind, but that's not for any good reason. It's just that the solver is absolutely a glutton for punishment and just wants as much accuracy as possible, even when that comes with basically no gain and tons of complexity. The Queen 10 looks a bit more normal. This one tends to follow the trend we already looked at, but for the human, we're going to use our predefined rough split of different sizes for bluffing based on the formula we just looked at. We're not going to change these combo by combo and also add blockers into the mix. This is a difficult enough thing to understand without doing that, so let's treat our bluffs in a more uniform way unless of course we're going massive on a flush river and there are some kind of anomalies or exceptions that cause us to want to avoid a certain combo. Maybe we need a positive blocker on a 3 flush river like the nut flush card when we're going all in for 4 or 5x pot. Homework for this week, I would like you to write out your thought process for playing and mixing the following hands in this river probe opportunity. We've changed the board this time, but we've kept the action sequence similar to what we looked at before. Don't use a solver here until you've gone through it and then go back and check your answers. I'll assume that everyone at this level is going to be using the solver and then checking their work, so I'm not going to go over the answers for you because that would be simply reading through the solver output. I've given you the tools that you need to do this exercise. For example, just quickly, you want to be first off recognizing what your hand class is. So with something like Jack 10, you want to assign that a value betting tier and assign it the right frequency. Your job can stop there. But with something like Queen Jack, you need to then do the more difficult and complex task of trying to figure out what your rough bluff to value split will be, what the pot odds modifier will be for each sizing, and therefore how often you'll choose each sizing with a bluff like that combo. Have fun with this. It's a bit of a tricky task, but as you do this, it gets easier and easier. And don't look for absolute accuracy. Clearly, we're not trying to be completely unexploitable gods of the game. We're just trying to do something sensible that's reasonable and a bit like what GTO is recommending. That's really all we can look for as humans. Let's get as close as possible without destroying ourselves in the process by trying to be overly detailed. Hope you enjoyed this class, guys. I know it's a bit of a tricky one. Have a well-earned break now, and then I'll see you back here for Lecture 7. Bye for now.